Hello everybody, my name is SNES Fun, and I welcome you all back to my next video here on YouTube, which will be a continuation of the video I did yesterday when I gave my thoughts on the NES Classic Edition. And for those of you who don't know exactly what that is, it's going to be a plug-and-play Nintendo-made system at the end of the year where they're taking 30 classic NES games, Nintendo and third-party mixed, and selling it for $60 for the holiday season. Basically, and how I gave my thoughts on that, and basically thought it was a good idea for balancing out, like, classic gamers, having them experience nostalgia and giving newer gamers a chance to, experience the classics. Some games that they probably never really played before, or if they have played before, maybe they never really played it on the actual type of hardware it was made on. Like a Nintendo, they probably played emulation, or, now the Wii and Wii U virtual consoles and stuff like that. 3DS and everything. And basically, in said video, I mentioned this before, and it has been mentioned online before. I've seen people on Facebook, since this thing was announced, say this and talk about this. I've seen people on YouTube talk about it, and the internet in general. And it was talking about, like, what if they did this for other systems? They did it for the Super Nintendo or the Game Boy or 64. Like, this is a classic edition type set of systems where they're going through their old lineup of systems, picking out the best games that define those systems, Nintendo and third party, and selling it so older gamers can have that nostalgia, be able to revisit the classics, and then newer gamers, like I said before, they can experience games they probably never played before, because a lot of newer gamers probably never had an NES or a Super Nintendo or a 64 or a Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, whatever. Like, what if they did this as a series of systems where they basically did more and more, systems. Like, they did this as they started with this NES system at the end of this year, and they go further with that. And that's what I wanted to do with this video. And like I mentioned in that video, for me personally, the Super Nintendo is the system that I started gaming on, that and the Game Boy. And that's where for me, the Nintendo system that's the most nostalgic to me is the Super Nintendo, because that's where I started gaming at. So in today's video, I basically wanted to give my thoughts, the 30 games I would include personally in a Super Nintendo Classic Edition. I have a list right here. We're going to go through them, and at the end, when this video is done, you could discuss it in the comment section what 30 games you would want, and so on and so forth. And we could see how similar our lists are and go from there. But let me get this started so this video hopefully doesn't take forever to, do. And to start off, I want, obviously Mario is the main mascot for Nintendo, so we have to represent, and on the Super Nintendo, quite frankly, there was a lot of Mario support as well. So I wanted to give a good amount of support to Mario, and I have 4 games here. Obviously, Super Mario World, one of the launch titles for the game, a classic Mario platforming game. A lot of people love it. You need Super Mario World. And then I also have Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, which, while not necessarily exactly a Mario game, it gives Yoshi the time of day. Yoshi's major first game, besides obviously stuff like Yoshi's Cookie and whatnot. And like, we have another Mario platforming type game, Yoshi's Island. Obviously, we will need some sort of racing game in this system. So I have obviously Super Mario Kart, the start of the Mario Kart franchise, 2-player. Battle mode and racing GPs and, stuff like that. You need Super Mario Kart because it was the start of the franchise. And then I also have Super Mario RPG, which the Super Nintendo was really like a very big RPG system. And Mario was in one of them. And since he's Mario, Nintendo's main mascot, and this was their collaboration with Squaresoft at the time, you need that in there. You need that defining RPG game that not only Nintendo's mascot, but in their collaboration with Square, but it's one of the top RPGs on the system, and that's really needed. So those are the 4 major Mario games. I wanted to include Super Mario All Stars, but I tried to stay away from collection pack type stuff, and especially because it would be this Lost World, but I decided to stay against putting in Mario All-Stars just for the fact I didn't want a big collection type game in there. Because it's already a big collection as is, and as much as I wanted to include it. The original versions are on the NES Classic Edition, so I guess maybe you don't want to double dip. So yeah, there's that. So that's the end of the Mario games. Then we have the first third-party game in there, and it's the start of a major spin-off to this franchise, Mega Man X. One of the best platforming shooting type games for the Mega Man franchise. It's like the classic Mega Man X game. A lot of people love that franchise. Mega Man X or otherwise is like home to Nintendo. Basically, you need Mega Man X in this collaboration. Then we have two more launch titles for the Super Nintendo: F-Zero and Pilot Wings. Now, F-Zero is necessary. It's the start of this franchise for Nintendo. It debuted Mode 7, just like Pilot Wings basically did, and these two define the launch of the Super Nintendo, the launch of two very important Nintendo franchises. Another racing game to add to Super Mario Kart with F-Zero, and we have Pilot Wings, which will be like kind of like, simulation type based pilots and type of game. It's like it's kind of cool to see where these franchises started, so you kind of have to include games like this. Then we have two Donkey Kong games, Donkey Kong Country 1 and Donkey Kong Country 2. I didn't want to do too much of Donkey Kong Country, so I didn't include the third one, but I think the first two define the franchise enough to the point where they basically, give Donkey Kong his just dues on this SNES Classic Edition. We don't need the third one necessarily. You just really need the first two, and it's nothing against the third one, but I wanted to have a nice varied setup of games, so I tried to cut that out to include other games in there. Then we are on to Super Castlevania 4, which you need Castlevania in this system. Castlevania defined a lot of Nintendo back in the day. The NES one, NES Classic Edition, has the first two games. You need Super Castlevania 4. It was the Castlevania game on the Super Nintendo, and Castlevania has a long historical status with Nintendo. So you kind of need that game, and it's like, beating up on zombies and monsters and stuff, like this beat up and hack and slash adventure, platforming adventure type game. You can need it, and it's a classic in the franchise too. Then, since there's a Double Dragon 2 in the NES edition, I include Super Double Dragon, because Double Dragon, just like Castlevania and just like Mega Man, are defining franchises that really got a huge, pretty much start with Nintendo. And it's also another two-player game. Before I go any further, I wanted to make sure a lot of the games I include on this were big multiplayer-based games, because that is almost a defining factor of the Super Nintendo, just like even the NES, and so on and so forth after that. So I tried to make sure a lot of my games had multiplayer in them, or define different genres that made the Super Nintendo popular and big in the first place. So yeah, Super Double Dragon, nice two-player beat-em-up type game. Then we have Contra 3, the Alien Wars. Contra, another franchise that was defined back then. And we have Super C in the NES edition. So what about the next Contra? The big Contra game for the Super Nintendo? It's Contra 3, the Alien Wars. Really hard shoot 'em up, type game. You can bring your friend. It's multiplayer based, just like I said with Double Dragon and whatnot. It really is a necessary game. If they have Super C in the NES edition, they have to have Contra 3 in this one. Then, obviously, we need the Zelda game, which is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. They have the first two Zelda games on the NES version. This one needs to be there. It pretty much was... the first game defined the franchise, but this was the one that really took it to the next level, basically. So you need The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And then, two more RPGs. The Super Nintendo was a very big RPG system. And since the original game of this is in the NES edition, I had to include both of these because they were Super Nintendo based. Final Fantasies 4 and 6, or for, us in America, 1 and 2. 2 and 3. Final Fantasies 4 and 6 were big RPGs for the Super Nintendo. They were released here as, 2 and 3. We need them. We need them. They were big RPGs that defined that genre. Just like Mario RPG. On the Super Nintendo, as well as the next game on my list, Chrono Trigger, another RPG that defined Super Nintendo. And we need that on there as well. It's a different style RPG, because the ones I've already named so far have been turn-based RPGs. And Chrono Trigger is not entirely turn-based. It has its own unique style. It's a unique RPG, so I said, you know what? Include it in there. because it needs to be the RPG that kind of stands out from the rest. Then there is another genre that's as big on the Super Nintendo as RPGs were, and that was the fighting game genre. And nothing was as big on the Super Nintendo as Street Fighter. Now, especially Street Fighter 2. So I included Super Street Fighter 2 because there's no point in having multiple versions of Street Fighter 2 just because different different ways they teched the game and stuff like that. I thought that would be a waste, so I picked the newest one that had all the characters. You get Cammy, you get T-Hawk, you get all the boss characters, you get DJ, and you have like the full roster of characters. I know you don't include the original, you don't include the ones like Turbo or anything. You include the full game that has all the characters. And then the other one, and this is the one that might cause a little bit of controversy because it is technically an M-rated game, or defined at ESRB, Mortal Kombat, and I chose because it's pretty much the best classic Mortal Kombat 2. But it's the other defining fighting game from back then. Not just Street Fighter, it was Mortal Kombat. So, Mortal Kombat 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 for the fighting games in this collection. Then we get back to some Nintendo games with Kirby Superstar, a defining Nintendo character, and the multiple little mini game type stuff in there. Now that's not really a collection as much as it's one game with multiple different stories, multiple different little modes. So I count that the same as like Mario All-Stars. And I'd say that's the defining Kirby game for the Super Nintendo. I didn't really do like the other Kirby games. I wanted to keep it to like the one that I thought defined it the most, and I think that's Kirby Superstar. And then we have Super Punch-Out, which Punch-Out's a classic in Nintendo's library. The original NES one is on the NES Classic Edition. You need the Super Nintendo version, so Super Punch-Out's there. Then there's Super Metroid, which is another classic Nintendo franchise. The first one's in the NES Classic Edition. You need the next one, the one that pretty much pushed that series to the next stage before, obviously, Metroid Prime and everything came later. And the one that a lot of fans really do have a nostalgia for and a love for. And one that's not as convoluted as the original. And then Star Fox, which that one might, I don't know if they'll have the technology to really do the 3D for it, but they should do it anyways and try to find the best way to get that on there, because that is a defining start to the Star Fox franchise, and defining, showing how the technology they had to make 3D objects like that back in the day. And it's a classic Nintendo franchise. The start of it, like how I said, it's the start of Pilot Wings and the start of F-Zero. This was the start of Star Fox. It's not just putting in all the games that were continuations from the NES, but putting in some games that made their start on the Super Nintendo. So, Star Fox is needed in there. Another beat-em-up game, Final Fight 2. And I picked Final Fight 2 because it was the multiplayer-based game. The first game was basically just a full-blown single-player game. I want to bring in the multiplayer. I want you to be able to do co-op with your friends and your family and everything. Just like I said with, Contra 3 and Super Double Dragon and stuff like that. You need it to be multiplayer one. And Final Fight 2, it's a classic franchise, Final Fight, for Nintendo, and probably one of the defining games when it comes to the beat-em-up genre for that system. Then we have Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Obviously, the first Ghosts and Goblins is on the NES Classic Edition, a big, main, freaking hard game for the NES. This one is just as hard, if not more. Game's a pain. Super Ghouls and Ghosts, another Capcom classic franchise that's going to make you tear your hair out. Then we have to have a shooting game, not a shoot-'em-up, a shooter game. And I picked Gradius 3 because they have one already in NES Editions. It was a genre that also was decently big on the Super Nintendo, the shooter genre. Space shooter genre, whatever you want to call it. Gradius 3 was the big one, I think, for the system, so I include that one for it. Then we have Super Bomberman. Especially for the two-player mode, which Bomberman's known for, being able to blow up your friends with bombs and everything. And Bomberman's a classic franchise. It had a big following of other ones. I picked the original because that was the start of the Super Bomberman franchise. But there are other ones on there too. And it had love on the Super Nintendo, single player and everything too. It's just a fun genre fun franchise that, defined Super Nintendo as well. And I had to, because Tecmo Bowl was included in the original and the NES Classic Edition, I had to include some sports games. Because while it wasn't as big on sports games as the Genesis was, the Super Nintendo had a lot of big sports games. And this is the thing, before I even got into this, I wanted to try to stay away from licensed games in this thing, because it looks like on the NES Classic Edition, there's no licensed games besides like Tecmo Bowl. I tried to stay away from it in here. That's the reason why you have not heard stuff like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles up to this point, and like a lot of the very full-blown licensed games on the Super Nintendo. As defined as they were, as awesome as they were, the licensing to get some of those big full-blown franchise, IP-type games might be hard, and since the NES Classic Edition doesn't seem to have any of those, I tried to stay away from those on here, except sports games. And since we had Tecmo Bowl in the NES Classic Edition, I include Tecmo Super Bowl here because you need your football love. And I included the original NBA Jam because who doesn't love NBA Jam? And it's basketball, big defining game. Back then, big arcadey sports basketball game. You need to have NBA Jam. And for the 30th game, the final and 30th game, I have for this SNES Classic Edition. It's a game, and this might be me playing favorites because it's a game close to my heart. It's my most nostalgic for me, but I think it defined the system enough to be included on a list like this. A Konami classic, Sunset Riders, shoot 'em up game, being cowboys, firing on all these people. It is so cool. It is such a classic game. I love it so much. It defined the system. It was the Super Nintendo version that defined that game besides the arcade, because the Genesis version was not up to par on the Super Nintendo version. Although it was still good. I haven't played it, but it does look still good. But I had to include it because I needed another Konami game in here alongside Contra and Castlevania and whatnot. And it's a defining game, and there's another multiplayer-based game, shoot 'em up, because I have beat 'em ups already. I need to shoot 'em up, so I include Sunset Riders. So that is my 30 games for an SNES Classic Edition. What do you guys think? Do you like these games? Would you agree with my list? Would there be any changes you want? What 30 games would you want in a Super Nintendo Classic Edition? Put in the comment section what you guys think, and we'll discuss it there. My name is Sniping is Fun. Peace. Please subscribe if you want to. Have a lovely day. See you all later in my next video, whatever it is. See you all later.